Last year, there were close to 24 million internal displacements linked to disasters, over half in our region. Disasters now cause almost 3 times as much internal displacement as conflict. Climate change amplifies their frequency and severity, meaning that displacement will likely grow. In fact, even if carbon emissions are reduced today, the degree of baked-in climate change means that things will get worse before they get better. This means we're likely to see more and more people on the move. Neither international law nor the domestic laws of most countries provides a clear-cut legal status to people displaced by the impacts of disasters, climate change or environmental degradation. Although refugee and human rights law may offer protection to some, it won't be an attainable solution for many. That's why it's essential for governments to anticipate and plan for movement, including by creating special humanitarian visas for people who are displaced, and by providing migration opportunities to let people move before disasters strike. Pacific leaders have declared climate change to be the single greatest threat to the livelihoods, security and well-being of their people. Climate change not only threatens lives and livelihoods, it also threatens loss of place, culture, family and identity, as well as dislocation from ancestral lands. In some places, climate change presents an irreversible and existential threat, particularly for low-lying atolls, where food and water insecurity are already a reality. Most Pacific peoples want to remain in their homes, but there's reluctant recognition that movement may be necessary and that considered, proactive responses have the best chance of ensuring that people can move in a safe, dignified and rights-respecting manner. This year, I had the privilege of working with Pacific governments to draft the world-first Pacific Regional Framework on Climate Mobility. The framework is intended to assist states to plan for and manage the movement of people within and from the Pacific in a predictable and secure manner. It identifies strategies to build the adaptive capacity of Pacific communities to remain in their homes for as long as possible, as well as to create safe and dignified pathways for movement where desired, and to provide protection and durable solutions if displacement does occur. So what should Australia be doing? Essentially, we need a toolbox of responses implemented in dialogue and partnership with our Pacific neighbours. Targeted policy interventions now could reduce the risk and extent of displacement in the future. First, we should support disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation to build up resilience in communities. By systematically integrating disaster risk reduction measures, there's a better chance that if disaster strikes, some people may be able to avoid displacement altogether, or at least be displaced for a shorter period of time. The UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction has estimated that there could be a 60-fold return for each dollar spent on preparing for disasters. Yet even in Australia, only 3% of disaster funding goes towards preparation, compared to 97% on recovery. Secondly, Australia has legal obligations not to send people back to countries where they face a real risk to their life or a real risk of inhuman or degrading treatment, including on account of the impacts of disasters or climate change. The UN Human Rights Committee has expressly recognised, and I quote, that the effects of climate change in receiving states may expose individuals to a violation of their rights, thus triggering the non-refoulement, that is the non-return, obligations of sending states. But so far, no case has succeeded on the facts at hand. That's why Australia should also create special humanitarian visas for Pacific people who are adversely impacted by disasters or climate change, both for people who are here when disaster hits and can't safely go home, as well as to help people to find safety in the aftermath of a disaster. In a report produced by the White House last year, the US acknowledged, and again I quote, that the US had a national interest in creating a new legal pathway for individualised humanitarian protection for individuals who establish that they are fleeing serious, credible threats to their life or physical integrity, including as a result of the direct or indirect impacts of climate change. So there's a strong case for countries like the US and Australia as well to create targeted resettlement places for people from particularly vulnerable areas to move, in addition to responding to people who arrive and seek protection. Thirdly, we should enhance voluntary migration opportunities so that people can move on their own terms. Migration can be a form of adaptation to climate change and an important risk management strategy. But people's ability to move safely and lawfully is largely conditional on other countries' immigration settings. Smart migration policies can provide people with choices to take control of their own lives, rather than being displaced if a disaster hits. The Lowy Institute has pointed out that if only 1% of the Pacific's population were permitted to work permanently in Australia, that would bring more benefits to Pacific peoples than Australia's aid contribution. Other policies could include bilateral or regional free movement arrangements, special training programs to prepare individuals to find work abroad, or preferential access to labour, education or family visas. The Australian government's announcement of a new Pacific Engagement Visa is welcome because it would enable 3,000 Pacific Islanders and their families to move permanently to Australia each year, rather than being stuck in cycles of temporary work and being separated from family back home. It remains to be seen, of course, how this visa will operate in practice. For instance, will there be more places set aside for people from countries particularly vulnerable to climate impacts? Or will it expand opportunities for already highly mobile countries such as Fiji, Samoa and Tonga? Fourthly, planned relocations of communities are another proactive response that can help to move people out of danger zones before disasters strike, or to move people to safer areas after a disaster if it's not safe to return home. In the short to medium term, most planned relocations in the Pacific will likely be internal, across short distances and from one origin site to one destination site. But over time, cross-border relocations might also be required, which raise very particular challenges. My own research with relocated communities shows that there can be long-term intergenerational consequences, including trauma and a sense of injustice. For this reason, it's essential that any planned relocations are undertaken with the full participation and consent of affected communities, with their rights and interests safeguarded. Pacific communities are well ahead of the curve. Both Fiji and Vanuatu have already developed guidelines on internal displacement in the context of climate change and disasters to assist government and other stakeholders to address and reduce vulnerabilities linked to displacement. Fiji has also created national guidelines on internal planned relocations and has established a Climate Relocation and Displaced Peoples Trust Fund. And here, like New Zealand has done, Australia should contribute to the trust fund to provide much needed financial assistance. Indeed, one of the biggest barriers in this field is the lack of sustainable financing to support responses to climate mobility. Financial investment is critical to ensuring that responses to mobility are effective and sustainable. Ongoing investment in people is crucial, including through livelihood diversification and support, education and skills training, community-based disaster planning and financial literacy, as well as a matter of international solidarity, collective responsibility and climate justice. Governments around the world need to step up. Responding to climate-related displacement is not just a humanitarian imperative, it's also in Australia's national interest. The stability and prosperity of the Pacific directly impacts us, while we in turn benefit greatly from the economic and social contributions made by Pacific people here. By enhancing migration opportunities, Australia could concurrently create economic opportunities for others. It could provide a release valve for Pacific communities facing demographic, environmental and financial challenges. And it could reduce people's exposure to the impacts of disasters and climate change in Pacific countries. This would be a significant contribution to the region as a whole.